The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $75, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Amos Reed did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought, a great dead street clock hauled out of the back of a fallen-in barn and laid on its side across a low flatbed, and a bed of timbers in the middle of a farm estate sale. A whole cast iron sidewalk clock come down off its corner and gone to ruin. The towering fluted iron column lay stretched along the timbers, rust scaled from base to crown. The ornate four-dial head canted beside it, with its dial glasses shattered and its cast hands frozen where they had stopped, the bronze striking bell going dull and green. And a movement inside a seized brown lump of rusted wheels with half its train missing. 90 years of weather had frozen every moving part solid, and the whole of it read to the crowd as a ton of dead scrap iron, a rusted monument to a clock that would never tell time again. Amos had just paid $75 to own all of it, the frozen hands and the seized works and 11 feet of rusted iron and all. It was a bright, clear morning, the kind of hard, clean light that pours across a farm lot in early fall, at an estate clearing sale on a played-out place at the edge of the county, back of the machinery and the milk cans, hauled out of a barn nobody had opened in years, the pieces of an old street clock that had stood over the main street of Ashford before most of the crowd was born. Amos was 74 years old, lean and a little stooped now, but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, wire spectacles pushed up his nose, and pale, patient eyes that took their time. His hands were broad and careful, the fingers still steady the way a machinist stays steady when he has spent a life turning true work on a lathe and coaxing seized things back to motion. He had come up in the trade in his young years, a machinist by his living and a clockman by his gift, the one the county sent for when the courthouse tower clock threw a pin. Until the county put an electric movement in the tower and the corners were modernized, and the men who could cut a wheel by hand and set an escapement by ear were quietly let go. He made his living since as a picker, but the steel and the brass and the slow, patient beat of a good movement never left him. The man who laughed was Dale Hooton, who ran the biggest scrap-and-salvage outfit in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud, cherry-red windbreaker he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a fat, unlit cigar in the other. $75, Dale said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $75 for a ton of dead iron that don't tell time, don't strike, and won't ever do either one again. The works are rusted to a solid lump, the hands are froze right where they quit, and it'd take a fortune just to stand the thing back up. They say even a stopped clock is right twice a day. Well, this one's rusted so bad it can't even manage that. You didn't buy a clock, old-timer. You bought a rusted iron tombstone for the time it used to keep. And you paid $75 to haul home a scrap load I'd have run through the shear for free. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the tombstone, and it stuck for the rest of that month, because a tall, dead pillar of rusted iron with a frozen face did look like nothing so much as a grave marker for the time it had once told. The crowd laughed because Dale laughed, the way a crowd does. Amos stood through it without a change in his face, his hands folded quiet in front of him, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something and forgot the rest of the time. Then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Amos's are who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Amos said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Dale Hooton could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Amos had stood over that rusted heap with a lifetime inside movements and towers awake in him. The crowd saw a ton of scrap. Amos saw the work. Under the rust, the wheels crossed out and finished by hand. The pillars turned and polished where a catalog clock would have been left rough. The deadbeat escapement built to a standard no factory ever troubled with. The ornate iron of the head cast with a richness the cheap corner clocks never had. This was no catalog clock stamped out by the hundred. This was one man's masterwork. And Amos knew that the old makers cast their names and the year down on the movement's backplate, inside the works where grease and grime and rust would bury them, so that only another clockmaker taking the movement all the way down would ever read them. What he uncovered over the winter that followed would put a forgotten master's name back on a record that had lost it for good. Amos had come up hard. He went into a machine shop young, apprenticed to an old clock and machine man who kept the clocks of a dozen towns, learning the lathe and the file and the long, patient feel of a movement until a dead clock came back under his hands and ticked true and struck on the hour. He and his wife, Esther, had kept the county courthouse tower clock for 30 years, Amos climbing the tower every week to wind the weights and mend what wore, Esther keeping his winding log in her careful hand and riding up the ladder with him on the cold nights, until the county put in an electric movement that wound itself and needed no man at all, and thanked him and sent him home. Esther had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own. And after she was gone, he lived alone in a small house behind his shop with his rows of tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hauling and no use at all for his hands. He knew that. A man who had spent his life keeping the hours over other men's heads could no more walk past a hand-made street clock going for scrap than walk past his own life, so he bid, because he had seen. Under the rust, the one thing that did not belong. If you've made it this far into Amos Reed's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first, the milk cans and the hand tools and the boxes of bolts knocked down to the pickers, while Amos waited by the flatbed beside his rusted clock. When the auctioneer finally came to the street clock and called for a bid, Dale glanced over, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Amos raised one finger, and the gavel came down at $75. He paid cash, signed the slip, and arranged to bring a flatbed and a chain hoist and a couple of strong backs around at the end of the day, because a street clock, even down off its corner, is a great deal of iron to move, and every rusted casting had to be chained and lifted like something that could still be broken. The story got around the town before Amos's trailer was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the filling station to ask, grinning, whether he meant to charge a nickel a look once he got his tombstone to tick. Vern Pickett, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer, that there was nothing left in a rusted-out street clock but scrap weight and heartache and a winter wasted and no time left alive in it to raise. Amos was buying penetrating oil by the case, fine files, and gravers, bar stock in brass and steel to cut new wheels and pinions, new blanks of dial glass, and a pot of dial paint, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent a life learning that a movement is either a master's or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Amos did not go tearing into it in the daylight, with the picker's truck still on the road and Dale holding court down at the sale barn. He waited until he had every piece home and laid out on clean benches and blocks in his shop, and then he went at it the slow way, alone, over the fall and the long winter that followed. The way a man goes at anything a careful hand once made and time has nearly taken back. He did not rush. He knew a clock keeps its truth down under the rust and the grime, and that you reach those places slowly. He soaked the seized movement and freed it a part at a time until the train turned again under his hand, cut new wheels and pinions on the lathe to replace the ones rusted past saving, and recast a broken bracket in his own small furnace, rebushed the worn pivots, and rebuilt the deadbeat escapement tooth by tooth until it would hold a beat. He straightened and painted the great column, releaded the forecast dials and set new glass, freed the frozen hands, and hung and cleaned the old bronze bell. It was the heart of it, the full tear-down of the movement to its bare backplate and the lifting of the old bell that he saved for last and came to the slowest, and it was the movement and the bell that gave the whole thing up. He brought the movement down to its bare backplate a screw at a time, and where the crowd would have sold it for its weight, he found instead the reason he had bid. Cleaned of 90 years of hardened grease and rust, the work came up clean and astonishing, all of it the hand of a master and not a shop. And down on the backplate, where grease and grime had buried it inside the works for 90 years, Amos's rag came away from a name. There, cast into the iron of the plate itself, where only a clockmaker taking the movement all the way down would ever reach, was the maker's own caste mark, a name and the year and the town, sunk into the metal by the hand that made it. And then, lifting the dull green bell and turning it to clean the inside of the rim, he found the other thing cast around the inner lip of the bell where it faced in on itself and no eye on the street below would ever see it, a line of raised letters worn soft with the years, a woman's name, and 4 words. Down at the filling station they were still asking when the tombstone would tick. Amos set down his rag and sat very still, because he knew the name cast in the iron, and he knew what it meant that it was here. The clock had its own long, hard history, and the town had let it go for scrap without once asking after it. It ran back to the great age of the American street clock, when towns raised tall, ornate cast-iron clocks on their corners as a point of civic pride, and a handful of masters cast movements so fine that a town's clock was reckoned the equal of anything in the cities. One of the greatest of them was a man named Ezra Fenn, who had taught himself the trade and built movements on his own. A master of no great fame in his own time, spoken of quietly among clock people as one of the finest hands who ever cut a wheel. His signed movements half legend because so few were known to survive. This street clock was his, the one he cast and machined for the corner of Main Street in Ashford, the one clock he had put everything he knew into. And in the same year he cast it, his young wife, Miriam, had died, and around the inner rim of the bell where it would ring out over the town but never be seen. He had cast her name and 4 words in memory of Miriam, so that the clock struck the hours in her memory over a whole town for the rest of its life, a private grief that no one on the street below ever knew. But the cheap factory clocks came, and in the modernizing of the corners, the tall old street clocks were reckoned junk and pulled down and sold for scrap iron. And clocks that had kept the town's time for generations were cut up for their weight. Finn's clock came down like that when Ashford rebuilt its main corner, and he had died poor and forgotten long before, and his masterpiece, his hidden line and all, was hauled off for scrap and lay dismantled and rusting in a farmer's barn until it came apart to a farm sale for $75. Amos took a rubbing of the cast mark and a roll of photographs to a horological society and clock museum, to people who kept the record of the old makers and a few surviving signed movements, and watched the room go quiet when they read the name. The horologist, a soft-spoken woman who had spent her life among old movements, went very still over the rubbing and said that documented. Signed street clock movement by that master, with his cast mark and a bell dedication both intact, never cut up for scrap, was a thing the field had counted as lost, the kind of clock that turns up once in a lifetime, if it turns up at all. The finest surviving 19th-century street clocks by makers of his rank, she told him plainly, had brought sums well past $100,000 at auction. A documented street clock by a maker of Finn's standing had sold not long before for $165,000, and this was its equal. Amos sat with that a while. The tombstone that the lot had laughed at for a month held, in the iron of it, a small fortune and worth more than the money, the last signed masterpiece of a master the record had lost, still striking the hours over the one name he had hidden for himself. The next morning, Amos did not call a collector, and did not sell the rare clock away to stand in some rich man's hall, and did not part it out for the original movement and the cast dials that would have brought far more broken up than the whole ever could, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $75 for a scrap load, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. Cutting the old street clocks up for their weight and their parts was the very thing that had killed Finn's masterpiece and 100 like it, and Amos had spent his life on the other side of that, keeping the hours running over men's heads, and there was no truth in doing to this one what the scrappers had done to its kind. So he did the harder thing. He set himself to see the master's name written back onto the record where it belonged, and the signed clock kept whole and put back to keeping time instead of sold off or cut up, and he went looking for whatever family the maker had left, because a man ought to know when his great-grandfather's lost masterpiece has come back into the light. Ezra Finn had a great-granddaughter living yet, a gray woman in a river town 2 counties over, who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old great-grandfather had made the clocks for the towns and lost every one of them when the corners were torn down, a story the family told as an old sadness and mostly let go. Amos went to her that spring with the photographs and the rubbing of the cast mark, and a close picture of the 4 worn words cast inside the bell, and watched her look a long time at the last of it. She put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up believing their great-grandfather's whole life's work was gone, scrapped or melted or scattered past finding. And here was his masterpiece come back whole, his signed clock and the one small thing he had hidden in it. The name in the bell that she knew, without being told, was her own great-grandmother's. She asked Amos why he had troubled to come so far to give a stranger back a name. He said only that a maker casts his name inside the works where the grime will bury it, because he needs to believe that somebody, someday, will take the movement all the way down and find him, so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having built the clock at all, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, and had rather leave a master his name back. There was one thing more Amos did before the clock left his shop, and he did it for the master and for Esther and for no one else. He finished it, set the movement back on its seat, and hung the weights, fitted the 4 dials in the hands, hung the cleaned bell in the head, and stood the whole tall column up straight in his yard. So on the last night, with the museum's people and the town's men coming in the morning, Amos wound the weights and set the pendulum swinging and stood back, and the great movement took up its beat, slow and even and true, the escapement letting the train down tooth by patient tooth, and when the hands came around to the hour, the old bronze bell struck out into the dark the first full hour the clock had tolled in a lifetime, the sound rolling away across the cold yard and the fields. He let it strike the hour out every stroke, and then he stilled the pendulum and let it go quiet again. That part was never the point. He had made it whole again and let it strike once, so that the man who cast it and the grief he had rung into the bell would be heard one time by somebody who finally understood what they were. That spring the clock went back where it belonged, raised again on its old corner over the main street of Ashford, with the master's name read clear at last on a bronze plate at its base, and his hidden line name beside it, kept whole and keeping time and striking the hours, not scrapped and not sold off, so that a clock that had been pulled down and cut up and laughed at stood tall again on the corner for anybody who cared to look. Ezra Fenn's name went back onto the record of the old clockmakers it had been dropped from, generations late, so the family that had thought his whole life's work lost knew at last that his masterpiece had come home. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter. And the people who had called Amos a fool let the name the tombstone drop and did not pick it up again. Dale Hooton was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look at close, and the next time he held court down at the sale barn the others did not lean in so far. Being right was the whole of what Amos had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten maker's name back out of 90 years of rust. They kept the clock standing where the town could see it and hear it, the dials re-leaded and the glass clear and the hands running true, and a bronze plate at its base telling how a master's lost masterpiece had kept the town's time for 80 years until it was pulled down for scrap, and how an old man paid $75 for the ruin of it and gave it back its name. And on a still evening that next fall, the light going gold down Main Street, Amos Reed drove into town to look in on it and stood on the corner in the last of the sun as the hands came around and the bell struck the hour out over the street, clear and even, the way it had when Fenn was alive. Amos was 74 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, scarred hand flat on the cool cast iron of the column as the last stroke rang, and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. Somewhere up in the head, the 4 hidden words rang out over the town the way they always had. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A master casts his name down inside the works where the grime will bury it, and rings one hidden name into the bell for no ear but his own, trusting that somebody will come who can take the movement all the way down and read what his hands made, so that being forgotten for a lifetime can never be the same as never having built the clock at all. And a town rarely knows what greatness it left to rust on its own corner until somebody troubles to save the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Amos Reed right to keep the master's clock whole and stand it back over Main Street under the maker's name, taking none of the fortune he could have had for it, or was that one decency too far? In a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.